and welcome to this talk by Professor Gacevich. So it's actually very much our honor and pleasure to have Professor Gacevich with us. And actually, I think for most of us, if not all, actually know about Dragon's work. But I'll try to just make it very brief. So Professor Gacevich is distinguished Professor of Learning Analytics and Director of Research in the Department of Human-Centered Computing of the Faculty of Information Technology and the Director of the Center for Learning Analytics and Monash University. Dragon's research interests center around data analytics, AI, and design methods that can advance understanding of self-regulated and collaborative learning. He is a founder and served as the president of the Society for Learning Analytics Research between 2015 and 2017. He's also held several honorary appointments in Asia, Australia, Europe, and North America. And he is the recipient of the Lifetime Member Award 2022 as the highest distinction of the Society for Learning Analytics Research, so SOLA as we know it. Yeah. So, and also a distinguished member of the Association for Computing Machinery, ACM, in 2022. In 2019 to 2022, he was recognized as the National Field Leader in Educational Technology in the Australian Research magazine that is published annually. He led the EU-funded Sheila project that received the Best Research Project of the Year Award 2019 from the Association for Learning Technology. And so it is really our pleasure and privilege to be able to have Dragon to be with us and talk about the future of education in the age of generative AI, which has been very much talked about now. So let's all give a big thanks.
Thanks so much for the kind introduction, also for the honor of the invitation. I'm really very happy to be back to Hong Kong, only after 6 months. We had a pause of more than 3 years, but we are seeing now each other much more frequently. And last time was also last time when I was talking to in January. Obviously, today I'm going to take a slightly different talk. I'm going to talk about this huge elephant in the room, which is generative AI. We've been all discussing for the last 7 or 8 months. Some people are sure in this room as well. I hear myself. Is that supposed to be?
So turn on your loudspeaker.
I think it should not be coming from me. Coming.
So on the other sheet.
I keep saying,
Yeah.
Maybe that one.
Yeah. So the good thing is,
someone opened the mute they did
Right.
okay, so
That's,
yeah, so please yeah, I also hear you.
try to mute you,
Maybe
colleagues.
someone in the audience.
it's okay now.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah.
Awesome. Good. So I'm going to be talking today about generative AI. And in a nutshell, I mean, when we are talking about generative AI, we really are thinking about relatively simple idea. Starting from data to train a large model, mostly language model, based on which we can generate other types of data. And other types of data are typically other text, images, potentially video, computer code, and many other things. So the idea of this is relatively, in a way, you can say simple, yet we are seeing as well that it's producing quite remarkable results. I'm going to review some of these results. But clearly from us in education, that raised lots of questions and opened so many debates. Obviously, in a broader context, lots of media, mainstream media from almost any major outlet in the world that you can think of had many different features about this topic. And for us in education as well, primarily we've been talking about generative AI in the context, it's disrupting our assessments. And what does it mean that that assessment is really disrupted? So we've been on this kind of really big global sense-making exercise in the last 7 or 8 months. And we really want to even kind of see that there are even some policy documents that are coming up in that space. So U.S. Department of Education has under its jurisdiction also the Office for Educational Technology. They published their guidelines. That was in partnership with the Digital Promise, some of the people who are in the room as well, some of the people who led this report, Jeremy Rochelle, who is quite active in the learning sciences. And then also UNESCO proposed a similar type of document that is primarily focused on higher education. I know several other organizations as well around the world are preparing similar types of reports and suggestions. They're just trying to help us all to guide the whole process. In today's talk, I'm going to really emphasize or discuss a few things. First one is, what is the kind of main promise or different types of promises we can get out of the generative AI? What are the challenges or what things are there to be concerned with when it comes down to these type of technologies? And also, what is the need or what we need to do next? What are our really general big next steps? Some of you know as well my approach to presenting. I want to give you away immediately so that if you lose me somewhere or if I'm going over time, I'm not worried. I'll deliver my key messages. The first one is that there's much promise to provide students with guidance, with different types of teaching support, with different types of also educator development support, and then also potential promises related to assessment and feedback. With respect to the concerns, there's lots of issues related to the reliability of these types of technologies, lots of issues with bias, also workload as well we need to work out, and then different types of issues with informed consent and the ethical practices. And the final thing is that, and you will see some very fresh example from the very last weekend we just lived through, is that we need to move really from the commentaries and half-baked ideas, especially in terms of the research, to proper, robust methodological research that is producing evidence based on which we can inform our practice and policy. So I'm going to start with some of the promise with respect to these type of technologies. I'm going to constrain myself that I'm going to be primarily looking at these type of approaches grounded in the technologies that are underpinning also the thing that probably most of you already know, and that's ChatGPT. And that's large language models. We've recently conducted a systematic literature review. It's still under review. It's still a preprint, something that I'm going to critique as well about, but it's a still resource you can access here. And this resource also is reviewing different types of applications through which we've seen the use of large language models in education, to different things that are related to identification of different types of resources that students can do, to generation of different types of resources, to also profiling different types of messages, how urgent or not certain messages should be answered to the students, to potentially even types of assessments. I'm going to be highlighting 4 of these key things that I think we should be paying attention to. Number one is also these large language models contain lots of promise that we can use them to guide learners, educators, and also in certain situations to help us with tutoring. Something that I think is really promising on one level is what we've seen that Khan Academy, I'm sure many of you heard of Khan Academy, is out there. They are developing their chatbot. It's underpinned by the technology called GPT-4, and it's a form of a chatbot that they are developing. It's called Kamigo, and Kamigo is on one level supporting learners in the tutoring. So tries to actually avoid learners to get the direct answers from the GPT technology, but instead tries to generate different types of prompts that are guiding students to come up with the solutions, answers, or learning strategies on their own. So they actually try to fine-tune that model with a range of different types of things that can help them to do it. At the same time, they also demonstrated certain opportunities how Kamigo can be used to promote creativity. The other types of things we've seen, and there's research already going on as well, I think primarily in Taiwan, and that is related to the use of large language models to support computing education. This is just an example. One of the colleagues in Australia, Hassan Khosrawi from the University of Queensland, was talking about that generative AI can actually generate really good source code programming. But while it can generate that, and potentially it could be useful for professionals for learning about programming and developing some of these computational thinking skills, it's much more interesting to think how these technologies can actually help us debug and offer them the reasons why certain components of their programs are not working, but equally so they can explain the code. So that tells us that these type of technologies are really good to help us in computational thinking. And similarly, while they are not really the best in kind of doing lots of arithmetic themselves, they are really good, these type of technologies, to explain also solutions of different types of mathematical problems or even the problems in physics. So it's another interesting promise. Number two, content generation and support for design. That is really interesting. This is the piece of work that is done by Manisha Bakari, also from the University of Queensland in Australia, in which she demonstrated how with very creative types of prompting, these type of technologies, not only can they offer interesting ideas for different types of learning outcomes that learners could be taught in a particular course, but also it can even generate the whole course structure and generate that in a format based on which the entire website can be produced. And then it could also be further fine-tuned. So that's an interesting idea. We are still talking about the promises. I've been speaking in Australia with several psychometricians. They love large language models. They say it's really good for them to generate items for high-stake assessments. It helps them a lot in sourcing different ideas and identifying what are the potentially promising assessments that then would be actually through the pipeline of the psychometric validation and reliability testing. And obviously, Khan Academy has this as well through their Camigo. It's actually offering teachers support to provide them with the ideas how they can teach their students, what kind of pieces of content they could use, what kind of design approaches can be it could be used for, etc. And similar is also a more recent piece of work that Chu Hui is going to see when she's at the conference later this year in Denmark at the Learning at Scale. It's called GP Teach. And that's basically the technology that was developed at Stanford that is used primarily to support teaching assistants, you could say also teachers, to practice their skills, where GPT technologies actually generating these artificial students, requiring different types of supports. So it can be basically used to practice, for example, office hours, or to practice, for example, simulated online discussion boards, or many different types of things. And the paper also demonstrates some early evidence as well, how students are, or these teachers in training are performing inside of these type of technologies. The next point, the third out of the four I want to talk about in terms of the premise, is related to the use of large language models for automated feedback. Feedback is something that we've been all struggling in education because of general time poorness of the people who are involved into the teaching and inability to dedicate sufficient amount of time that we can provide with each student. We earlier this year, our students got really excited and we ran a study in which the idea was the extent to which we can use large language models to generate feedback that is similar to the feedback that students are getting from their human tutors in higher education. So this was a course in higher education. We used different prompting strategies to ask ChatGPT to generate feedback, and we are replicating this now as well and finalizing with GPT-4 as well. What we found is that in terms of readability, our participants find this type of feedback that is generated by ChatGPT far more readable. And it's also far more extensive because human tutors are really time poor and they provide very brief feedback, while ChatGPT will keep generating tests for as long as you want. However, there's no really great level of alignment between human and GPT provided feedback. What human tutors find to be positive, GPT can say negative things about things, and vice versa. So that potentially creates two things. One is that GPT is completely off, or that human tutors can be enhanced or empowered with this type of technology to also consider other alternative ideas for feedback. And the number three is that we always thought they will just maybe focus on the correctness of the answers of the students, but we are seeing traces of even some feedback at this level, or that is on the level of the process and maybe at the level of self-regulation. So GPT-4 in particular would actually not only provide certain comments on what students did, but also give them prompts, what to think about, as well as the next type of a thing. So it's a really interesting thing to explore this further, but it's still kind of a concerning if it's providing the type of feedback that is completely incorrect. So we need to investigate this further. This is a piece of technology we've been developing, and I will be mentioning later. It's called Flora, and it's a system developed that builds upon any other web resource that is out there. It was supposed to be always providing students with additional tools such as highlighting, note-taking, different types of annotations, also has a tool for planning, also has a tool for time management, and the tools as well for different types of other features that are supporting students through generative language models. So it supports students also to write. And so this is the whole feedback that students are getting on their writing. So the feedback is basically on the level of the quality of the integration of the arguments that students are putting together inside of their assessment. And this type of detection is done by us fine-tuning these large language models so they can detect certain types of categories. In our case, this was done primarily by building each sentence, trying to identify the level of the Bloom's taxonomy. So whether students are just demonstrating they are remembering certain facts to the level that they are actually synthesizing certain facts and integrating it from different ideas. And the system then allows students to take the charge. Similar is also that the system is actually able to do a range of different types of things. This is an example of how students can use to improve their writing, the quality of English. We have also certain types of other rubrics that are supporting academic writing as well as originality of the writing. The final fourth point about the promise I'm going to discuss is, and you see that I'm framing here that I'm seeing AI as a promise for assessment rather than the AI as something that is completely compromising our assessment. So it's a kind of a different thing. Last year, we had this paper in which we discussed how AI can help us with different types of assessments. And we reviewed that around 5 different dimensions. Number one dimension would be that assessment often is very onerous for the instructors, for the teachers, to actually prepare in a sound manner. And these type of AI technologies can make these type of things feasible. Like, for example, we just saw some of the examples of the assessments as well as the students are writing, particularly very formative type of assessment. Then assessment is mostly very kind of discrete, happens in limited periods of time. And with the AI, you can actually have far more continuous type of assessment. Many of you probably heard of adaptive computerized testing. So instead of testing everybody on the same test, we can actually adapt it to the students' level of the knowledge or different types of skills, which is not something I'm going to be particularly emphasizing today. But then assessment also can be fairly authentic. Rather than to actually have the students just to have certain types of knowledge tests, we do lots of these type of things in simulation-based learning with teachers in actual practice classrooms, as well as we are doing that with, for example, nursing students. But in the online setting as well, we've been collaborating with a group such as David Schaefer through virtual internships that creates fairly authentic type of environment in which certain things can be assessed. And the final thing is that our assessments potentially can be measuring something that is modern type of a skill. So I'm going to touch on the three of these points here and just give a few examples. So in terms of feasibility, I just gave the example of the writing assessment and how it can be done, but also in our systematic review of large language models, you can actually see that assessment in form of the scoring of the essays, short answers, etc., is fairly reliable. This is the level of the reliability of different types of large language models to do different types of automatic assessments of the students' writing. So that's really one interesting part that can be found in this audit review. And then based on that, inside of this Flora environment as well, we are kind of creating a tool where we are considering that we are not giving the students directly these assessments, but we are using this to inform teachers' work in terms of the assessment, and looks into the rubric, and then different components of the rubric potentially can be automated. To me, where I'm actually the most passionate about is this kind of continual assessment, but the assessment that is actually looking into the actual process. We've been, so far in education, mostly assessing the final product. But learning really happens while we are creating that product. And in many cases, our assessment is compromised because we are just seeing that final product. But we really want to see what is that dark side, how that product came about, and so how we can actually help the learners learn the better things. Again, inside of the Flora environment, you can see it, that we embedded ChatGPT, and then the ChatGPT is actually now, in our case, further primed in such a way that students are writing the essays, they can ask the question, can I get the advice on my essay? But we are together with that question sending students essay as well as relevant content. And then ChatGPT is fairly good at providing some suggestions. However, what we are doing as well inside of the Flora, and that's where my learning and learner's passion is coming, is that we are tracking different types of events that learners are generating as they're interacting with different types of tools. When they're planning their learning, when they're using ChatGPT, we know every time, every prompt they use, every piece of content GPT generated for them, we know all these things. But we also collect other type of data about their mouse movements, about their keystrokes, everything else. And then we have the engine that is mapping these, we call that raw traces, into the cognitive, metacognitive, and other types of processes. So we can actually see what exactly they are engaging to in terms of the quality of their, in our case, we are looking to self-regulated learning, but you will see also some other dimensions of it. And then we actually look, okay, so what are we getting? Can I actually, how these type of processes are potentially predictive of the essay scores or the final products that you're doing. And you can see that all these green bars are demonstrating the amount of the contribution that these processes are providing to the final outcomes of the students. So you can see that in terms of these final product, we only have coverage of the topics and some essay cohesion, while far more variance in the students' quality of the essay is actually explained by the processes they are doing. The other thing is that we are also using epistemic networks. And these epistemic networks can actually create for us signature of the students' processes when they are interacting with these type of AI technologies. And then this is the example that we can actually compare highly performing and super lowly performing students. And we can see that lowly performing students are just setting goals and going to the assessments, rather than to actually engage into relevant other processes to develop their learning. And not only that, but we can also statistically compare them. So this becomes almost like a fairly psychometrically robust type of an assessment that we are doing as part of the process. And we are actually seeing how that is shaping up students' utility of their cognitive resources together with the artificial resources that are provided to them. Then the final thing is, what skills do we need to measure? What is the modern assessment? Do we need to still measure just simple writing of the students? And if so, at what level? And when we need to actually engage into something else? We published this study relatively recently. And in this study, we looked at the quality of the students' how the extent to which ChatGPT can generate reflections. And we compare these reflections with the actual students' reflections. The actual students' reflections were from a school in our university. That's the only school that is #1 in the world in their own subject discipline. GPT beat students so badly on this route, right? It was for them even a bit of a reputational concern. Should we do this or not? We didn't name it, right? You see that I'm carefully not naming them as well. But the question is, if this type of a thing can generate responses that are better than students, then clearly we should be actually thinking about something else to be done for these type of assessments. We should not be then generating, encouraging almost students to automatically do these type of things. But instead, we need to think about how these learners can engage much deeper into their reflections. And maybe this product itself is not particularly relevant. Perhaps we should even this type of thing measure through the process that I just illustrated. So this is nice and potentially the rosy land of generative AI. What is the dark part of generative AI and some of the concerns? Well, first one is that just the AI techniques behind the scene are not flawless. They are far from being flawless. For anybody who's interested in this topic to actually engage much further, there's a book that is actually not super brand new. It was published in 2018, early 2019, by Gary Marcus and Ernest Davis. And Gary Marcus is particularly prominent on social media as well, talking about these topics. And I actually found it fascinating when it was published to look at some of these things. Whatever they said in that book, that these type of technologies are suffering from, no matter which new version we are getting on GPT, etc., is still suffering because there's a fundamental architectural problem with these type of technologies that we need to acknowledge. So first and most important thing is that these technologies have no notional planning and reasoning. They just basically are really good at identifying which words are closest to each other and how they can be best sequenced in most of cases. In a way, they are solving the prediction problem. So prediction in many cases, it means it's to a certain extent guesswork, right? It's a really great guesswork, as you can actually see, but it's still to a certain extent guesswork. They have no sense of truthfulness. For them, two words being together or not doesn't care. This type of technologies don't have a mechanism to know whether something is true or not. They have no really causal inference. If you have a child, I've been blessed to have a child, and you learn from the child so much about human learning as well, your kid needs to bang their head on this wall once, and it'll learn, they'll never do it again. These technologies need to do that millions and millions of times before they actually will not do it. So that's really important type of a thing to think about. And also they don't have common sense reasoning. So they don't have that. It's not embedded. They're solving the prediction problem. They're not solving these type of problems. If you are interested to kind of learn a little bit more about all these different types of failures, there's a person who is actually trying to have an archive of different types of failures. It's a really useful resource. Hasn't been updated for a couple of months now, but I think they probably already exhausted everything. So like in good old qualitative research as well, once you exhaust and you reach your saturation, you don't really have to update your data so much anymore. I want to talk about workload implications. And these types of technologies come with a huge promise. They'll just pump up our productivity. We'll all be so good at doing more things for much shorter time. Perhaps, but it was a really nice commentary earlier this year in The Atlantic that actually put into the perspective some of these type of technologies with existing technologies we know. I love the example of email because it concerns me a lot personally. Email is so great to increase productivity of communication with everybody. But my goodness, it just destroys my workload because every email comes with another task. So what is the implication of these type of technologies? Like plagiarism detection is out there. Whether you agree or not with some of these technologies is a different point, but it's also incorporating so much more workload into our academic stuff because they now need to look into that, and if they are having to override some of the things that the machine said, they have to justify themselves. Doesn't reduce their time. There also are certain types of things that are coming more kind of as examples. This is another example came in the Washington Post earlier this year, where they were actually trying to solve some of the kind of journalistic type of tasks. And for the experience, journalists actually generated far more errors that they actually concluded this is not useful for me. So it's not necessarily particularly useful in every area. There are very few studies. This MIT and Stanford study was looking into the productivity that could be increased in a problem-solving task of a large organization. Problem-solving task being a call center. And they were running the study in the Philippines, and they reported the overall productivity improvement of about 14% for the entire 5,000 workforce. However, they noticed that that productivity was primarily due to the novice who were getting the advice. Any experienced workers in that organization did not get any productivity improvement, except that the experienced ones were actually generating prompts and the type of fine-tuning these type of generative AI technologies. So in a way, in their case, ChatGPT was a knowledge management technology than anything else. And then the final thing is what we also found. We had a systematic interview a couple of years ago when we looked at automatic feedback and how that automatic feedback is affecting productivity of the teachers. Yes, it was associated with the students' improvement of the outcomes, but there was no reduction of the workload of the teachers, because teachers had to spend now more time on working on the design, engaging students to support them in the use of some of these automated technologies. Third, ethics. We cannot possibly avoid ethics of these type of things. There's lots of things. There was a study earlier this year published in the Journal of AI, ED, that is looking into the way if you are using automatic scoring technologies for short or long answers. And what they found is that basically that these decisions can made automatically can affect negatively the learning experience of many learners. And they made the recommendations that we should be primarily deferring these important decisions to the machine, to the actual human teachers. So in a way, equip the teachers with these type of technologies, but then eventually it's the human decision. And the final thing, even if they are presented to the students, it should be clearly labeled, it comes from the machine. It's not the human brain. So lots for us to consider about that to avoid some adversarial effects. Our systematic review also looked at the level of the transparency. Whether these type of systems that we are exploring that are based on generative AI are actually transparent to the different types of users. They are primarily transparent to the AI practitioners and researchers. But they are really not so transparent to educational technology experts and enthusiasts. And they are not at all made transparent to the educators, students, and parents. So that's where we are at the moment. So in a way, if we are actually trying to engage our learners and parents and educators, we need to work much more on this tier 3. The other important thing is that we have no way to track if some of our data gets into these systems. Because the terms of the use of our personal data, our prompts, text which shipped into these type of technologies is not completely clear. If it's used for the training these large language models, there are potentially some implications for that. So maybe some of you saw this, that in Italy, at least temporarily, court banned the use of ChatGPT due to the concerns of the violation of general data protection regulation in Europe. And then the key question to me is that the problem is that these language technologies are designed in such a way that they cannot easily unlearn what they learn. In the same way as when you learn something, you cannot do it. I mean, why your life can be in danger if you see something that you're not supposed to be seeing, right? Because you cannot unlearn it. And that's the thing also with this type of things. And then the difficulty is really that we cannot know. There's a small probability that that same information will be replicated as it was entered. But there's no way that we can note, that we can easily predict when that information will be spit out to somebody and whether they'll be potentially offering some of the things that will be harmful. Final point with respect to the concern is the fairness. Are these models fair? Well, this is one of the main sources of these models. Wikipedia. Who is that Wikipedia authored by? Primarily by what? White male. So don't listen to me. At least in my defense, English is not the first language, right? But it's also primarily Western white. Black, obviously, they're all usually Western white. And then the other important thing is in terms of the sources of the language. Predominantly English, at least according to our systematic interview, and somewhat Chinese. But we know that there are far more Chinese speakers for whom Chinese is the first language than those for whom English is the first language, although English is generally like a universal lingua franca. So that's the other important. The other important thing is really obviously surfacing is this is one of these technologies that is generating images from text on this very prompt. Why a superhero has to be masculine? And why does it have to be basically the superhero that is based on the Americanized version of the superheroes that are coming typically to the Marvel's movies? But that's what it is, because we have that bias embedded into the data. And this is a really nice illustrative example. Kudos, by the way, to one of our PhD students for this example, Jimmy Young. And then we also did a study last year as well, published in a major computational linguistics conference, to see whether we can actually, just based on students' discussion messages, if we are using generative AI technologies, detect the gender of the authors, where we limited gender only to the binary men and female. You can see that we have actually accuracy of almost 70%. So it's not a perfect accuracy, but it's not by chance. So in a way, these models are actually containing that bias as well, whether it's a man or a woman, or second language or first language as well. Thankfully, we looked also that some of that bias can be reduced, and we proposed some algorithms for that, but it has to be tested from case to case to case to case, right? And we actually are not quite aware. We need to estimate that bias. This was on one of the other alternative previous large language models. So we have no idea. It will be difficult as well to estimate that in GPT type of technologies. Final part of my talk today, need. What do we need to do? Well, the first one is that we need to start thinking how we can develop and measure AI literacy. So why this is important? Because AI is not going to go away. As simple as that. This is a relatively recent report as well, came out of OpenAI, the organization behind ChatGPT, and it basically indicates, did a study of a large register of different types of jobs in the US, and they looked more than 1,000 different professions, and they looked into the specific type of tasks that large language models can potentially expose them to automation, or at least the use of them. And they indicated that about 80% of the jobs may have up to 20% of the exposure. And within that 80%, about 90% of jobs may have even exposure up to 50% of their tasks. That exposure doesn't mean that these tasks will be automated. It may mean also they may require the use of AI, or different professions may regulate how that AI can be used. And this is really another evolving example, very recent one. A lawyer in the US who was defending a large airline. They tried to use the ChatGPT to file the court documentation that is needed. And then basically the prosecution complained to the judge they cannot find any single case that they were citing in their filing, because ChatGPT just hallucinated, lied. And this lawyer had no idea. So the judge fined him in contempt of court and fined him as well for that, because they acted in bad faith. I don't think they acted in bad faith. They were just incompetent in terms of the use of AI. And this type of AI technologies actually will tell us really how important this AI literacy is relevant. So what is AI literacy and what we are doing? I think we are really in very early days of conceptualization. One of your colleagues here published in the Journal of Editing as well, Continuous Education AI, this conceptualization of AI literacy that looked through the Bloom's taxonomy. It's a really interesting piece of work. In my view, it's also kind of emphasizing a bit more technical type of AI. Does not really look into some other dimensions as well that are relevant, but it starts from kind of basic knowledge to the level of creation, but in a way goes into a bit more engineering type of things. Really interesting. Last year as well, we edited this special issue, and a colleague from Australia University of Sydney, she logged this polylog we had, in which we looked 3 different types of dimensions that we actually somehow eventually consented or created a level of a consensus about should be looked at. What is cognitive? So in a way, what does it mean to be a self-regulated learning? What are those kind of cognitive and metacognitive implications of learning with AI? What are the humanistic parts as well? So in a way, how we are actually seeing AI through the human values, and also thinking about AI through the human centeredness as well. And then the final part is this social perspective as well, seeing that the human communication will be mediated with some of these technologies, because they are generating lots of text, so they will be also generating that as well. So what does it mean that mediation is part of the process? The other perspective is interesting as well. George Siemens led this piece, and it basically talks about human and AI, and human and artificial cognition. I'm not completely kind of in agreement in the language of the artificial cognition, but there's something this other artificial part that is doing. At least it's a computational part. And there's this intersection or the relationship that we need to be thinking when humans and AI are working together on a task. And they are hypothesizing that that happens based on that learning, sense-making, and decision-making is happening at this intersection. The other interesting perspective comes from human-centered design and Ben Schneiderman, and talking about building of AI that is human-centered, and thinking about that really highly reliable, safe, and trustworthy systems. And similarly, then the assessment as well can be, and the AI literacy can be looked at different levels here as well, that when we have high level of control, human control, and high level of automation. So that's a really interesting thing. How this can be assessed? It's a billion-dollar question, I guess, for many. We've seen a number of self-reported assessment instruments. They're promising, but they mostly assess beliefs. And it's important to assess these beliefs because you can actually see what people think about quality of the outputs they can get, reliability of these outputs, the fairness, bias, etc. So I definitely agree that self-reports are one component of that assessment. But we also know that people are so bad at self-assessing, so unreliable on doing these type of things. And so we need to have something else. This is one previous work we did as well, when we tried to see how certain types of processes of human regulation can be affected with different types of technological interventions. That was in the time when we were experimenting with different types of social media recommender systems, so that we can actually see how certain types of technological features are influencing certain types of cognitive and metacognitive processes. And so we need to do that as well of understanding, so that we can also complement that potentially with the other approach when I was talking about the process level of assessment that I was previously talking about. And I'm gradually getting to my final point, and that's basically understanding actual impact on learning. What we have at the moment is really that we have lots of commentaries. Everybody is sharing their opinion papers, blogs. This is great, exciting. No, there's a doomsday coming of all these type of things. But we really need to kind of engage much deeper into proper research. So I had this kind of hypothesis that given the really great fluency of the responses that GPT can produce, that fluency actually can create this almost, I call this lazy metacognition, because you don't see easily discrepancies. A well-known mathematician, Terence Tao, who is an Australian-American researcher, professor math prodigy said, when you generate the papers that are supported with ChatGPT, it makes it much harder to identify mathematical flows because of that fluency. Right? So how do we then learn and work with these type of technologies where we can actually have lots of even more unreliability because of that? There's a thing as well in sociology. Henry Frankfurt is a sociologist and has a book on bullshit. By the way, that's a sociological concept. So I'm just using scientific terminology here. And the bullshitting is really defined in a way when somebody is trying to convince you about something that is truthful without really knowing what is the truth. And it was a really nice podcast as well in the New York Times opinion section by Ezra Klein and Gary Marcus I was talking about, where they actually were talking how ChatGPT is really confidently always give you these responses, but without knowing what is the truth. And that's something we need to think about. There's the other thing which is called sense-making paradox. It's what is documented in information-seeking behavior literature. And it basically looks into the things that we ask learners often to seek information and produce certain types of written products on topics and subjects in which they have no prior knowledge, right? When you are getting such a fluent response that you have no prior knowledge, how can you actually approach that to increase your learning opportunities? That sense-making paradox is, I think, is now even more perpetuated as part of the process. Learning is such an important learning tool. Writing is such an important tool, at least for me. Helps you sort out your thoughts. It also promotes that innate dialogue that you may have with yourself. It's a really powerful tool to provide you feedback, to detect discrepancies in your thinking, to detect whether you can coherently or not coherently put together different thoughts that you may have. What happens if we eliminate that opportunity for learning and cognition and offload into these type of technologies? I think it's an important thing to be studied. The other important thing is also that these technologies are really good at generating something based on our questions. But there's literature as well in educational psychology for the last 30 years, Art Gracer being one of the most prominent educational psychologists, that bases that most of people don't ask good questions when they're learning. Right? So I need to be very meticulous at prompting these technologies to give you the right outputs. So then how do we get the right outputs if we don't know how to ask the right question? Right, in many of these cases. And then the other important thing is we need to be very methodologically rigorous. There are many studies showing how GPT technologies are outperforming humans on many different types of tests and everything. There was earlier this month, published a paper by a group of people from MIT showing how GPT-4 can ace everything in computer science and electrical engineering at MIT. And then few of the final year seniors at MIT were actually frustrated with that, and they decided to replicate that study. This is you can see the dates from this I didn't put them here, but this is the last weekend. They reviewed that, methodologies flowed. They were actually using ChatGPT also to mark the students' performances. And so they were, instead of performing 100% accurately, they were actually not performing so well at all, because the methodologies are flowed. The problem is, though, that this paper and this study they were actually trying to refute was not even peer-reviewed yet. They just put a preprint. And we live in the era of preprints. And we need to basically be always assigned this label, it's a preprint, not rigorously review the research. In the same way as we actually had lots of these debates during the pandemic for epidemiological type of research. So then the other important thing is in education, we really have very limited understanding of the chatbots, how much they are valuable, especially based on these large language models, because they can be so unpredictable. What we know from the existing research, there are some old chatbots. They were really meticulously trained for a particular subject. And they were also trained with particular types of strategies, etc. In a way, they are based on rules. They were not based on these stochastic models. This is Beetle that is used for electrical engineering education. My good colleague, Johanna Moore from the University of Edinburgh was working on it. And then at the University of Memphis, Art Gracer and his group developed this whole family of the auto tutors that we use for many different subject areas and with different types of multimodalities, etc. I remember keynoting at the same learning analytics conference with Nancy as well 2 years ago back in the US. And they also demonstrate all these interventions, how they can be beneficial or not. But then we are studying that, for example, in the context of self-regulated learning, these chatbots. And this is a new systematic literature we submitted. You can see that kind of oranges bars kind of primarily rule-based and the technologies that are underpinning these type of technology, these type of chatbots. None of them are at the moment in terms of the literature based on large language models. That's number one. If you are studying self-regulated learning, like I do as well, we have no chatbot as well that is comprehensively supporting the entire cycle of self-regulated learning. Only some small fragments. In a similar way as we observed in the learning analytics literature, but they are potentially complementary. And that's something that we can explore further as well. So that's my talk. So just a couple of final remarks. I hope I highlighted enough that we really need to broaden our understanding of learning with, about, and despite artificial intelligence, particularly generative. So it's unlikely to go away. So we need to lead the change. In education, we need to see the space. And if you are interested in further sense-making in that process, in this whole space, pay attention to Global Research Alliance for AI in learning and education. There are lots of different resources that are there available, and also opportunities to engage with others, plus a whole conference dedicated to empowering learners for the age of AI, and many other interesting things. So thanks so much for your attention, and look forward to talking to you.
Well, thank you so much.